Okay, in the lecture last week, we have a quick introduction to the basic principles for carbon footprint assessment. Okay, we have product-based and we have project-based assessment. For product-based, is this based on a life cycle assessment concept. And then for project-based or region-based, the carbon emission for a region, for a building, for an organization, it would be usually based on a year emission, okay, annual emissions. And yeah, I know that we didn't explain too much about how to do the assessment. So in the lecture today and also next week, okay, we will study the principles, the detailed principles and guidelines of emissions reporting. Okay, we will do some calculations in the workshop. Okay, so to next week, you should have formed groups already. Okay, so next week, you should have group members ready. So if you go to the content page workshop, you should be able to find this link to the group list. So please fill in your preferred group members before the end of this week. Okay, so next week, maybe next Monday, I will compile the group list. So if you don't have any preference of group member, then I will just put you to a random group, all right? So next week, I will explain some more about what you have to do in the assignment. And actually, if you go to the folder workshop, you will be able to find an assignment example. Okay, so in this example, you will see some information about an organization, and then there are also some calculation tables about the carbon emissions. Okay, so if you have time this week, you can take a look at this document, and then next week I will explain to you what are these calculations. Okay, and you may read this example together with this set of emissions factor tables. Okay, this is the emission factor tables that we need to use for the workshop. Okay, so these two have to be studied together. Okay, so if you have time, you can study this workshop sample and the emissions factor table. And next week, we will also have a look at this example. All right, and then in the workshop, you will do an assignment like this. Okay, like the sample I gave you here, and you have to do it in a group. Okay. Yeah, and you have to finish the assignment during the lecture time. Okay, so within that 3 hours, you have to finish the whole assignment, the whole calculations. I will give you some answer sheets. Okay, I will give you some table for you to fill in, and then by the end of that lecture for the workshop, you have to submit that set of table. So one group submit one set of calculation. It is a group work. So 1 grade for the whole group. All right. So that's the plan for the workshop. And then for today, yeah, we will study the principles and guidelines of emissions reporting. Actually, we have learned about the greenhouse gas corporate protocol in the lecture last week. So apart from the greenhouse gas corporate protocol, we may also refer to the ISO standard, the EPD, EMSD guidelines, and the General Reporting Protocol, which is a document issued in the North America. Okay, so today we will study these documents. Okay, for the EPD, EMSD, I think we will leave it to next week. Okay, so why emissions reporting? Why do we need to report the emissions? So climate change could lead to significant impacts on resources availability, economic activities, and human being. Okay, climate change affects all of us. And when we want to address climate change, usually it is referring to the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. So climate change arising from the anthropogenic activity has been identified as one of the greatest challenges facing the world and will continue to affect business and citizens over future decades. So the benefits of emissions reporting would be we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by improving an environmental operation and adopting suitable offset program. Okay, so measure the emissions and then identify any potential reduction sources. And yeah, so only if you can measure the emissions, then you can manage and maybe you can reduce it. Okay, demonstrate the organization's commitment and competence in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. So it's about the image of the company. So if you want to attract the business from environmental conscious audience, citizens, then you better report your greenhouse gas emissions and try to reduce it. Enhance public awareness about the importance of combating climate change. So I think for the government, okay, it is very important to report, okay, to measure and to report the carbon footprint, okay, and then to plan for some climate policy and also the mitigation strategies and the target of like, so by 2050 we want to achieve carbon neutrality, and then by 2035, okay, we want to reduce half of the carbon footprint. So this is only possible if we are able to report the emissions. Okay, support the fulfillment of applicable legal statutory requirements. So maybe one day we need to pay for the carbon tax. So the carbon tax will be based on the carbon emissions of the product. Then we also need to find a systematic way to measure the carbon emissions. Okay, mandatory emissions reporting. So apart from some voluntary reporting, okay, in like US and the UK, it is already the regulation. So in the US, the US Environmental Protection Agency started the Environmental Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, which became a law on 1st of January 2010, and it forces 85% of the nation's top emitters to report on how much greenhouse gases they have emitted. So most of these emitters would be fossil fuel suppliers, industrial gas suppliers, so these energy provider. And in the UK, in June 2012, the UK coalition government announced the introduction to mandatory carbon reporting, requiring all UK companies listed in the main market of London Stock Exchange, so around 1,100 of the UK largest listed companies, to report their carbon, their greenhouse gas emissions every year. So just like Hong Kong. The Hong Kong Exchange and Clearing requires listed companies to disclose climate-related issues in their ESG report. So you can just go to the internet to search for like the ESG report of CLP, okay, or the ESG report of Swire, okay. So all the big company, all these listed company in the stock market has to disclose their ESG and therefore their carbon emissions. So listed companies have to disclose any climate-related targets they have set and whether any climate change mitigation adaptation efforts they undertake will change their business models and strategies. So this is to assess any risk when there is climate change, okay, maybe some physical damage due to severe extreme weather, or maybe when there are some climate-related policy, okay, like carbon tax or other, like the emissions trading scheme. So if there are these policy being introduced, then what would be the impact to the business? So these should be related to their emissions and their environmental strategies. They are also required to disclose the Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, while disclosure of Scope 3 emissions is voluntary. I think starting this year, Scope 3 will also be mandatory. Okay, you can check, but Scope 1, Scope 2 is a must, and then Scope 3 is already a trend. Okay, you have to. So maybe not mandatory yet, but sooner or later it will be mandatory. Okay, additionally, they will have to disclose the resilience of their business models to climate change impacts and the percentage of their assets or business activities that are vulnerable to climate risk or aligned with climate-related opportunities and the funding budget for them. So these are about how they will combat climate change, what is the risk of climate change to the business, and then any opportunities for the business to, or for the company to make more money, okay, by like maybe some mitigation strategies and then trade the credits in the market and so on. This is an example of the ESG report for CLP and Tongass, and they are open to public. Okay, you can try to download to read one of them. So for the emissions reporting guidelines, we have the Greenhouse Gas Corporate Protocol, okay, which is issued by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and together with the World Resources Institute. So last week, we have briefly learned about the principles of this protocol. Okay, and actually they are more or less the same. Okay, so we have the greenhouse gas protocol, and then based on this protocol, we have the ISO standard and the general reporting protocol. And the local guideline, EPD, EMSD guideline, it is also with reference to these international standards. So let's talk about the ISO standard briefly. Okay. So the background of the ISO standard. So back in 1997, the IPCC, that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, published guidance for developing national inventories under the Kyoto Protocol. Okay, so according to the Kyoto Protocol, different nations have to reduce their carbon emissions, right? So if you want others to reduce the emissions, then you have to suggest a systematic way for them to report. So that's why the IPCC issue a guidance. So different organizations, so they have increasingly interested in reporting their greenhouse gas emissions, but organizations took their own approach to quantification. So although we have the guideline, okay, but this guideline is not too complete, okay, only the very first guideline. And therefore, different organizations use their own approach for quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions. And the greenhouse gas information was not readily comparable, okay, because they use different approach. Then it is difficult to compare the greenhouse gas emissions by different organizations. So in 2001, the first edition of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol was published by, together with these two organizations. And this is the first attempt at harmonization at the organizational level. So the very first standardized method for reporting greenhouse gas emissions that can allow us to compare among different organizations. And then in 2002, the ISO Technical Committee on Environmental Management established a workshop, a working group to develop international standard for monitoring, reporting, and verifying greenhouse gas emissions and removals. So according to the ISO standard, there are different number. Okay, so not just for reporting, but also for verifying. Okay, so for reporting and also verifying. Okay, for number 3 is for verifying. We have the third party, so you have to hire the third party to verify your report. And this verifying process will be according to the ISO standard 14064-3. So the ISO standard provides clarity and consistency for quantifying, monitoring, reporting, and validating or verifying the greenhouse gas emissions and removals. Its use includes to enhance environmental integrity of greenhouse gas quantification, enhance the credibility, consistency and transparency of the greenhouse gas quantification, monitoring, reporting, verification, and validation. So ISO standard, right? So we have a standardized method. So if you use the standardized method, then your report will have the authority, okay, or will be more, will have a creditability, okay, to the public. Okay, so to facilitate the development and implementation of greenhouse gas management strategies and plans, facilitate the development and implementation of mitigation actions through emissions reduction and removal enhancement. Only when you can measure and report the emissions, then you can reduce the quantity. Okay, facilitate the ability to track performance and progress in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and or increase in the greenhouse gas removals. So these are the reasons, okay, for us to have standardized measurement method. Okay, the applications of the ISO standard 14064 corporate decisions such as identifying emissions reduction opportunities and increasing profitability by reducing energy consumption, risk and opportunities management such as climate-related risk, and voluntary initiative, greenhouse gas market, regulatory, government greenhouse gas program. So all these activities, we can apply the ISO standard. Okay, we can apply the ISO standard when we want to report the greenhouse gas emissions so as to sell the credits to the market in the ETS, or maybe there is some regulation, okay, about carbon tax. Okay, then we can also apply the ISO standard, assess our own carbon footprint, and then to pay, okay, for the carbon tax. Or maybe you want to reduce your carbon emissions. So there are at least 3 numbers of ISO 14064 standard. So for number 1 is a specification with guidance at the organization level for quantification and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and removals. So for a company, for an organization, then if you want to quantify, if you want to report the carbon emissions, then we will use number 1, okay, for organization, for a corporate, for a company, okay, or for PolyU, okay, we will refer to number 1. And then for number 2 is the project level. So maybe you want to implement a PV panel project, okay, so as to reduce the carbon footprint of PolyU, okay, and you just want to study the effect of this project, the PV panel, okay, then it is a project level and we will refer to number 2, okay, so different standard for different application. For a company, for an organization, we use number 1. For one project, for one like carbon mitigation project, then we use number 2. And for number 3, specification with guidance for the validation and verification of greenhouse gas assertions. So if you, when you have prepared a carbon emissions report, according to the ISO standard, you need to find the third party to validate your report. Okay, so this is according to number 3. It specifies the guidance about how to validate, how to verify the data or the carbon emissions. I think we have explained this flow chart generally last week. So we have number 1, the organization level, and then it will give you some guideline about the greenhouse gas inventory and the report, and then maybe for your organization you can claim that, okay, the carbon emissions for this year is how many tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And then for number 2 is for one project level, and then similarly you have the reports, and then you have the greenhouse gas statement, like by implementing the PV panel in the PolyU, okay, we can reduce how many tons of carbon dioxide a year. Then this is the greenhouse gas statement. and the third party, okay, will validate your report to justify whether this statement is true or not. Okay, and for today, we will focus on number 1. Specifies, for number 1, the ISO standard 14064, number 1. It specifies the principles and requirements at the organization level for quantification and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and removals. It includes requirements for the design, development, management, reporting, and verification of an organization greenhouse gas inventory. Okay, greenhouse gas inventory is a table, okay, which summarizes all the greenhouse gas sources and also sink, okay, all the sources and the sink and their respective quantity, okay, in terms of the greenhouse gas, every kind of greenhouse gas, the carbon dioxide, and then how much methane, how much nitrous oxide is being emitted in those emission sources, or maybe how much carbon dioxide could be absorbed by those sink. Okay, maybe you have planted some trees and so on. And these sources and sink should be within the boundary of that organization. And for quantifying the organizational boundary, if you still remember, we have different approach. We have the equity approach and the control approach. Okay, these are some approaches to identify the boundary of an organization. Okay, and the standard includes requirements for determining greenhouse gas emissions boundary, quantifying an organization's greenhouse gas emissions and removals, and identifying specific company actions and activities aimed at improving greenhouse gas management. It also includes requirements and guidance on inventory, quality management, reporting, internal auditing, and the organization's responsibility for verification activities. So just some update to the second editions. So in the second edition, a new approach has been introduced to the reporting boundary, and the greenhouse gas emissions, which used to be other indirect greenhouse gas emissions, now renamed to be indirect greenhouse gas emissions. I think I can skip this. Okay, and the reporting principles, the same 5 numbers of reporting principles. I think last week, according to the Greenhouse Gas Corporate Protocol, we have already learned these 5 reporting principles. So relevance, completeness, consistency, accuracy, and transparency. So relevance would be, we will select the greenhouse gas sources and sink removals according to the boundary, okay, so within the boundary. So if those sources are outside the organizational boundary, then they are not relevant, okay? So relevance is one of the principles, and then completeness. So include all the relevant greenhouse gas emissions and removals. So has to be complete. So all the sources, you should not miss anyone. Okay, and consistency, the same approach should be used. Okay, the same assessment method, the same approach. So maybe for the base year, you have selected the equity approach for identifying the organizational boundary. Then in the coming years, in the other years, you should use the same approach to define the organizational boundary. Okay, so consistent, so such that we can compare year to year's emissions. Accuracy, so reduce bias and uncertainties as far as practical. So if local data are available, then use the local data. Okay, if the on-site measurement data are available, so also use the most accurate data on hand. And finally, transparency. So disclose sufficient and appropriate greenhouse gas related information to allow intended users to make decisions with reasonable confidence. So it is to provide all the data and the assumptions and maybe assessment method to the audience so that they can understand your calculations. Okay, transparency. So didn't hide any data and yeah, make everything available to the audience. And this is the flow chart for the procedures for doing the assessment. So first of all, determine the organizational boundary. Okay, so many organizations may include many subsidiary or other sister companies. So which one should be included? Then this is the first step. Okay, determine the organizational boundary. Whether you use the equity share approach or the controlled approach. And then next, determine the reporting boundary. The reporting boundary is just like the operational boundary that we have discussed last week. Okay, last week when we learned about the Greenhouse Gas Corporate Protocol, the term is operational boundary. But here in the ISO standard, it is called the reporting boundary. Okay, that is under scope 1, okay, which sources will be included. And scope 1 will be direct emissions. Okay, so maybe the reporting boundaries include a diesel generator, okay, that will emit greenhouse gases within the boundary, okay, direct emissions. Or maybe you will have a natural gas boiler, okay, also direct emissions under scope 1. Or maybe you own a car, okay, that will emit carbon dioxide, so also scope 1 emissions. So these are reporting boundaries. And then scope 2, you consume electricity within the organizational boundary, okay, but there is no local emissions of carbon dioxide within the boundary. Okay, the emissions is far away in the power plant. Okay, but it is related to the activities being done in the organizations. Okay, then this is indirect emissions due to the consumption of energy or electricity. Then this would be scope 2. And we have all other indirect emissions under scope 3. Okay, so this is about, yeah, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emission sources. And then next, after you have defined all the reporting boundaries, then you have to collect the data so that you can quantify the amount of emissions. Okay, so quantification of the greenhouse gas emissions and also removals. So maybe you have planted some trees, okay, so as to absorb the carbon dioxide, then these are removals. Or maybe you have some carbon storage technology, okay, to store the carbon dioxide, to store the greenhouse gas, then these are also removals. Okay, so this will be based on many data collected, and then you do the calculations. Okay, and next, mitigation activities. So maybe you can propose, you can study whether you can implement any mitigation activities. Okay, and then greenhouse gas inventory, quality management, reporting, and finally, you find a third party to verify, to validate your report. So this is the procedure for greenhouse gas reporting according to the ISO standard. Okay, so last time we have already explained the organizational boundary, okay, but a bit brief. Okay, so today let's study the organizational boundary once again. An organization's greenhouse gas emissions and removals are aggregated from facility level quantification of greenhouse gas sources and sink. So one facility may install, there would be installation and production process, and it may include many different facilities. Okay, maybe it owns some offices, some data center, and then some retail shops, and then maybe some manufacturing plants. So which one should be included? Okay, it is the defining the organizational boundary. So organizational boundary is the extent to which an organization assess and reports its emissions. So to which extent? So yeah, what is the boundary? So it defines the operational and geographical limits within which an organization quantifies and discloses its greenhouse gas emissions. So an organization usually comprises one or more facilities. So the facility level greenhouse gas emissions or removals may be produced by from one or more greenhouse gas sources and sink. So for each facility, okay, there could be more than one greenhouse gas sources and more than one greenhouse gas sink. Okay, so the first step is to identify which facility to be included in the organizational boundary. Okay, the organization should consolidate its facility level greenhouse gas emissions and removals by one of the following approaches. So control approach or the equity share approach. When a facility is owned or controlled by several organizations, these organizations should adopt the same consolidation approach for that facility. So maybe, due to one company, okay, maybe owned by different companies, maybe 10% belonging to company A, okay, 20% belonging to company B, and so on. So in this case, all the companies should use the same approach for identifying the organizational boundary. Otherwise, there would be some double-counted greenhouse gas emissions. The organization shall document and report which consolidation approach it applies. So if you go to check the ESG report, maybe of CLP or by town gas, you will be able to find their control approach. So as far as I remember, for the CLP group, they should be using the equity share approach. Okay, so, and for consistency, so this year they use equity share approach, then next year they should also use the equity share approach. Okay, because we want the reporting to be consistent so that every year we can have a fair comparison. Okay, organization must apply the same organizational boundary approach consistently to all activities. So for this company, we use equity approach. Then for another subsidiary company, we also use the same approach. All right? So the same approach across all facilities under that company. The organization accounts for all quantified greenhouse gas emissions and or removals from facilities over which it has financial or operational approach. So this is the control approach. Okay, first of all, let's talk about the controlled approach. And there are two types, financial control and operational control. So for financial control, it means an organization has financial control over the operation if it has the ability to direct the financial and operating policies of the operation with a view to gain economic benefits from its activities. Okay, this is the definition for financial control. So basically, if you can earn money, okay, from that organization, then it means you have financial control. Okay, like if you wholly own a facility, then definitely you have financial control. Or maybe a group company or subsidiary company, so belonging to the parent company, then you also have financial control. Or maybe you govern the financial policy of a joint venture under a contract, okay, then you also have financial control. And for operational control, an organization has operational control over an operation if it or one of its subsidiary has full authority to introduce and implement its operating policy at the operation levels. So, for example, if you wholly own the facility, then definitely you have operational control. And if you hold the operational license of that facility, then you also have operational control. And if you have the authority to introduce and implement operational policy of the partnership or the joint venture under a contract, then you also have operational control. Okay? And next is the equity share approach. The organization accounts for its portion of greenhouse gas emissions and or removals from respective facilities. So it is according to how much does the company own that facility. So equity share is the percentage of economic interest or benefits derived from a facility. So it reflects the activities that are wholly owned and partially owned according to the organization's equity share in each. So unlike the controlled approach, so the company either has control or has no control. Okay, so if they has the control, then they 100% responsible for the emissions. If they don't have the control, then they are responsible for 0% of the emissions. Okay, so either 100% or 0% for the controlled approach. But for the equity share approach, it is based on the percentage of the share. Okay, so the emissions is based on the share of the percentage of the share. So equity share is the percentage of economic interest. Okay. So the uses of the equity share approach. So it increases the usability of greenhouse gas information for different users, and it aims to mirror as far as possible the approach adopted by financial accounting and reporting standards. It is also useful for multinational companies with operations in a number of different jurisdictions, like different countries, aiming to determine their greenhouse gas footprint. Okay, so I think the equity share approach is more commonly used. It is more straightforward, okay, easier to follow. But it has a prerequisite, okay, it has some condition, okay, such that you can apply the equity share approach. Okay, and the condition is that the ownership percentage of each facility and the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions or removals from respective facilities, including using production share agreements, are available. Okay, so if for that facility you know the percentage of ownership, okay, then you can use the equity share. If you don't know the ownership, then no way you can use the equity share approach. So for example, here, okay, let's say for this company, it has 20% equity share of the factory A. Okay, so it means this company owns 25% of this factory, and this company has financial control, but it has no operational control. Okay, and this factory emit 1,000 megaton of carbon dioxide equivalent in a year. Okay, so let's say for this company, it wants to calculate, okay, how much is it responsible for the emissions from factory A. So now this company may use different approach for identifying the organizational boundary. So let's say it used equity share. So if this company used equity share to define the organizational boundary for all facilities, okay, then for this factory, because it owns 25%, then it will be responsible for also 25% of the emissions from factory A. So that is 250 megaton of carbon dioxide equivalent, okay, if it is using equity share approach. And And if this company is using operational control, okay, and for this company, it does not have any operational control, then 0. Okay, so this company has no operational control, then it will be responsible 0% of the emissions. And if, so instead of operational control, this company is using financial control, and it has financial control, then this company will be responsible for 100% of the emissions of factory A. Okay, so different approach, then different amount of emissions responsible. Okay, so for identifying whether it is financial, whether the company has financial control or has operational control, sometimes it is a little bit tricky. Okay, so don't worry, in the test or in the examination, okay, I will tell you explicitly whether, yes, the company has financial control, or maybe this company has no financial control. Okay, so I will just tell you explicitly whether they have or have no financial control or operational control. Okay, so step 2, after identifying the organizational boundary, then the next step will be the reporting boundary. Okay, the reporting boundary is just like the operational boundary that we have studied last week. Okay, the organization shall establish and document its reporting boundaries, including the identification of direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions and removals associated with the organization's operation. Okay, so after you have defined the boundary, then within that boundary, we have different kind of greenhouse gas emission sources and greenhouse gas absorption or sink. Okay, so we have to identify all these and then put them into different group scope. So there are different kind of emissions and removals, direct emissions and removals, and indirect emissions. But there is no indirect removal, okay, only emissions. So for direct greenhouse gas emissions and removals, it would be the greenhouse gas emissions from greenhouse gas sources and removal from the greenhouse gas sink owned or controlled by the organization. Okay, so it is within the organizational boundary. So maybe wholly owned by the company, by that organization, or maybe controlled by that organization. Okay, financially controlled or operationally controlled by that organization. Okay, then those direct emissions would be under scope 1. Okay, these would be the direct emissions. But if those emission sources is outside the boundary, okay, not controlled by the organization, not owned by the organization, then these would be indirect emissions. Okay, we can talk more about indirect emissions later. Okay, so separate quantification for carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and these greenhouse gases, and they should be measured. Okay, in first of all, you may measure or calculate their amount in terms of maybe kg or g or ton. Okay, but in the end, you have to use the global warming potential to convert them into carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, so just like in the workshop, you should quantify the emissions of the carbon dioxide, methane, and the nitrous oxide, and then you need to use the global warming potential to convert tons of methane into tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. All right. Okay, apart from direct emissions, you also have indirect greenhouse gas emissions. So these are the greenhouse gas emissions that is a consequence of an organization's operations and activities. So it is due to the activities of that organization. But that arises from the greenhouse gas sources that are not owned or controlled by the organization. Okay, so the source is not controlled by the organization. So for example, in order to conduct this lecture, I have to switch on the lighting. Okay, and this lighting, okay, is because of the activities in this lecture theater. Okay, and this lighting will consume electricity, and indirectly it will lead to the greenhouse gas emissions in the power plant. Okay, then arises from the greenhouse gas sources not owned by PolyU, right? So the power plant not owned by PolyU, not controlled by PolyU, but these electricity consumption, these greenhouse gas emissions is due to the activities within the organization. Okay, then these are the indirect emissions. And similarly, like the furniture, okay, we are using the furniture in this classroom. We are consuming some supplies, and these are all due to the activities in this classroom, okay, this lecture. Then these are also indirect emissions. And you may also include the emissions due to transportation from your office to here. Okay, also indirect transmission, okay, because you have to attend the lecture. So you drive, or maybe so you take the train, and then it causes the greenhouse gas emissions indirectly, okay. And these emission sources are out of the organizational boundary of this PolyU, okay, but it is related to the activities here, okay. Then these are also indirect emissions. Okay, so according to the ISO standard, we have scope 1 and then scope 2. Okay, so scope 2 and scope 3, they are both indirect greenhouse gas emissions. So direct will be scope 1, and then for indirect, it includes scope 2 and scope 3. Okay, and for scope 1, apart from emissions, there is also removal. Okay, for example, you plant a lot of large trees in PolyU, then we will have some direct removals of greenhouse gases. And for indirect, okay, there are scope 1 and scope 3. For scope 2, scope 2 and scope 3. And for scope 2, it would be some imported energy, okay, like buying electricity, or maybe town gas, or maybe elsewhere, maybe we consume steam. Okay, so these are imported energy. And because of the consumption of electricity, so there would be greenhouse gas emissions in the power plant. And because of the consumption of town gas, okay, in the town gas company, there is some industrial process going on, and in order to produce the town gas, okay, there would be some carbon emissions. Then these are scope 2. Okay, so last week, one of the students asked me about the town gas emissions. So for the town gas, we burn the town gas, right? So like for my home, I am using town gas water heater. So it means inside my toilet, okay, I am burning the town gas. So it means that there would be direct emissions, right? I'm burning the town gas and it will release carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So this would be under scope 1. Okay, this is direct emissions. But at the same time, because I am buying the town gas from the town gas company, and in order to produce the town gas and transport the town gas to my home, there would be some carbon dioxide emissions, some greenhouse gas emissions. And these sources is out of my control. Okay, then these would be scope 2. Okay, so if you check out the town gas, there should be 2 emission factor. Okay, one for scope 1 and the other one for scope 2. Okay, 2 different emissions. One for direct emissions when you burn the town gas, and then the other one would be scope 2. Okay, from imported town gas, and these are indirect emissions far away in the town gas company. Okay, and for the other, all the other would be scope 3. Okay, for example, from transportation. Okay, you took some train, or you drive, or you take bus to this lecture to attend the lecture. Okay, then these are indirect emissions, or maybe from the products used by the organization. Okay, these furniture, or maybe in the canteen. Okay, we consume food, or in your company you drink coffee. Okay, these would be under scope 3. Or maybe the waste that you produce. Okay, the paper that you throw away, or even when you flush the toilet. Okay, these sewage water. Okay, we need to spend energy to treat the water before it is discharged to the sea. So there would also be greenhouse gas emissions implication. Okay, associated with the use of products from the organizations. So if the organization is a manufacturer, okay, and it may produce some products, and these products will be consumed by the customer. Okay, so during this process, maybe during the consumption of the goods, some greenhouse gas will be emitted. Okay, then these are also indirect emissions under scope 3. Okay, due to the product sold by that organization. Okay, and other, okay, all other sources. So let's talk about scope 1 first. So scope 1, I think is easier to understand. Okay, direct emissions. So for example, direct emissions from stationary combustion. So stationary. So it means these would be not vehicle, okay, not a car, not a ship, not an airplane. Okay, so these are stationary. So for example, a boiler, okay, or maybe you have a furnace for burning some stone, okay, for manufacturing process, or maybe you have a diesel engine generator, okay, electricity generator, or maybe you have an incinerator burning the waste, and then for other industrial process. Then these are all direct emissions from stationary combustion. Okay, burning something, burn waste or burn fossil fuel, burn natural gas. Okay, stationary combustion. Another example would be direct emissions from mobile combustions. So the mobile would be cars, vehicles, airplane, ships, and so on. Okay, these vehicles, these mobile transportation vehicles within the organizational boundary. Okay, so it doesn't include emissions from journeys in vehicles outside the organizational boundary. So if that vehicles is not owned by the organization, or maybe not controlled by the organization, then not included. Okay, just like the bus that you take, okay, not owned by PolyU, right? Then it is not scope 1. Okay, it will be under scope 3. Direct emissions and removals from industrial process. So for example, in the manufacturing of cement, okay, in this industrial process, in that chemical reaction, carbon dioxide will be released. Then this is direct emissions. Direct emissions, fugitive emissions from the release of greenhouse gas in anthropogenic system. So maybe there is leakage of refrigerant in the air conditioning system. And the refrigerant, like some HFCs, these are also greenhouse gases. Okay, then these leakage of greenhouse gases from the system would also be direct emissions. Okay, under scope 1. Another example would be in the landfill. Okay, maybe your organization owned a landfill. Okay, and then in the landfill, when the organic waste decompose, it will release methane. Then these emissions of methane would also be direct emissions because you own that landfill. Okay, that landfill is within your organizational boundary. Okay, direct emissions and removals from land use change, and forestry, which covers all greenhouse gases from living biomass to organic matter in soils. So maybe you plant trees, or the opposite, you chop down the trees. Okay, then these are direct emissions and removals. All right, so scope 1 I think is easier to understand. And the next one would be indirect emissions. Okay, indirect emissions from imported energy. So this category includes only greenhouse gas emissions due to the fuel combustions associated with the production of final energy and utilities, for example, electricity and heat, within the organizational boundary. So you consume electricity. Okay, and then because of this consumption of electricity, some fuel is being combusted, and then carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases are emitted. Okay, but these sources of emissions are outside the boundary. Okay, but it is due to the activities within the boundary. Then it would be scope 2. Okay, due to the imported electricity and energy. And it excludes the emissions associated with fuel, emissions from the construction of the power plant, and emissions due to transport and distribution losses. So when the electricity is being transmitted far away from the power plant, there would be some transmission loss. Okay, the transmission loss will also indirectly lead to greenhouse gas emissions. And these should not be counted in scope 2. Okay, it should be counted in scope 3. Okay, for example, greenhouse gas emissions related to the production and consumption of electricity imported by the organizations. So for an ordinary organizations, just check the electricity bill. And then using the emission factor by the utility company, you will be able to calculate the scope 2 emissions. Okay, just check the utility bill. Another example, greenhouse gas emissions related to the production of energy consumed by the organization through a physical network. Yeah, like consuming steam, heating, cooling, compressed air. Okay, so for scope 2 is very easy to quantify. Okay, because the utility company already measure how much electricity you consume, how much town gas you have consumed. Then just check the electricity or utility bill, and then use the emission factor by that company, and you will be able to find out the emissions under scope 2. Okay, for scope 3, these are indirect emissions, and there are many different kind of indirect emissions. Okay, so many type, and yeah. So if you want to quantify all the scope 3 emissions, it would be very difficult. Okay, so usually for an organization, they will choose the significant emissions under scope 3 for quantifying in the report. Okay, because it includes just too many emission sources. Okay, so the first kind of scope 3 indirect emissions would be the indirect emissions from transportation. So this category includes emissions occur from sources located outside the organizational boundary. So that's why we call it indirect emissions. And those sources are mobile. They're from transportation, so mobile, and are mostly due to the fuel burned in the transport equipment. So some like gasoline vehicle, okay, and then you drive that vehicle back to work, then is the scope 3 emissions. And that vehicle is not owned by the organization, then it is scope 3. But if that vehicle, that car is owned by your company, controlled by your company, then it would be scope 3. Okay, so the first step is always identifying the organizational boundary. Okay, example, emissions from upstream transportation and distribution of goods. So maybe I am a company for manufacturing water bottles. Okay, and in order to make these water bottles, I need some raw material. So these raw materials may be imported from other countries. Okay, so maybe they take the ship, okay, to transport these raw materials to here, and the emissions due to the transportation process would be under scope 3. Okay, that ship not owned by my company, okay, outside my organizational boundary, but it is due to the activities of my organization, okay, then under scope 3. And similarly, apart from upstream, okay, apart from transportation of the raw material for my manufacturing process, I may also need to transport or distribute the water bottles into some retailers, okay, into some distributor. Then these are downstream. So maybe I will use some truck, okay, some truck to transport these water bottles to the retailer, to the distributor, and I do not own that truck. I do not operate, I do not have any control of those trucks. Then these emissions due to the transportation will be under scope 3. Okay, employee commuting, okay, like how you go to work by train, or you drive, or maybe you take taxi and so on. Okay, client and visitor transport, okay, similar to employee commuting. Business travel, okay, maybe you travel to another country by plane, then the emissions due to that air travel would be under scope 3. Okay, if transport equipment is owned or controlled by the organization, then the emissions shall be taken into account as direct emissions. So like if I am transporting the water bottle by my own truck, okay, I own those trucks, I control those trucks, and I use these transportation truck to distribute the water bottle to the retailer. Okay, then these emissions would be under scope 1, okay, because I have control over these trucks, so within my organizational boundary. Okay, a question. So when the reporting organization is leasing a fleet as a leasee, so that organization rent a fleet, okay, rent a ship, and the emissions should be reported as direct or indirect. So if financial control is chosen, okay, and this organization is leasing a fleet, so it means it cannot have any financial gain from that fleet, so it has no financial control, then the emissions due to this fleet, these mobile emissions due to this fleet should be reported as indirect under scope 3. But if operational control is chosen, so you have control over how to use the fleet, what is the operation schedule, and then how far it will travel. It had control of the operation of this fleet, and you are using operational control, then it will be direct emissions under scope 1. Okay, so it is just about how you define the organizational boundary. So if that emission source is within the organizational boundary, okay, maybe by equity share or by controlled approach, okay, is within the organizational boundary, then it should be counted under scope 1, direct emissions. If it is outside, but due to the activities of your organization, then it would be scope 3. So in respect to which option is chosen, attention should be paid to omissions or double counting issues. So one emissions should be either counted in scope 1 or scope 2 and scope 3, but not in scope 1 and also in scope 3. No, okay, never. So either scope 1 or scope 2 or scope 3 under one organization. Okay, I mean under one organization, it should be either scope 1, scope 2 or scope 3. Okay, another kind of indirect emissions would be the indirect emissions from products used by the organization. So it includes emissions occur from sources located outside the organizational boundary, associated with goods used by the organization. So for example, the indirect emissions from goods purchased by the organization. Okay, like in your company, okay, maybe when you take a break, take a tea break, and then you drink a coffee. So those coffee that you drink may indirectly contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. Then these would be under scope 3. Okay, these are the goods purchased by your organizations. Or maybe the consumption of A4 paper. Okay, also the goods purchased by the organization. And the indirect emissions from services used by the organizations, okay, like consumption of water, okay, or you have to process the water, and then the sewage, okay, you also need to process the wastewater before they are drained away. Okay, then these are also services used by the organizations. And also the indirect emissions from goods purchased by the organization. This is the goods purchased by the organization. So the A4 paper, raw material, and the A4 paper. So in order to manufacture the A4 paper, you have to extract the raw materials. Okay, maybe some plants or some timber, and then manufacture, processing the raw material, transportation, the raw materials between the suppliers and then to the distributors. So all these emissions will be counted. And if your organization has used this A4 paper, then all these emissions should be counted in scope 3. Okay, indirect emissions from services used by the organization. Okay, emissions from disposal of solid and liquid waste. So the waste that you throw away, okay, the water, solid waste, or municipal solid waste, liquid waste. And emissions from the use of assets generated through equipment leased by the reporting organization in the reporting year. Okay, these are also scope 3. And the emissions for the use of service that are not described in the above subcategory, consulting, cleaning, maintenance. So basically all about service provided by the company and indirectly generate carbon footprint, then will be under scope 3. Okay, indirect emissions associated with the use of products from the organization. Greenhouse gas emissions or removals associated with the use of products from the organization result from products sold by the organization during life stages occurring after the organization production process. So just like I am a company manufacturing water bottle, okay, so when I sell these water bottle to the customer, so how they use it. So in the operation, okay, maybe they put the water bottle in the washing machine, okay, in the dish washing machine, and then consume some electricity and generate carbon dioxide. Or maybe when they throw away the water bottle in the landfill, maybe somehow it caused some greenhouse gas. So these would be due to the product, the use of the product from the organization. So in most cases, the organization does not know the product's exact destiny through its life stages, and therefore should define plausible scenario for each life stage. So I am the one who manufacture the water bottle. So I will not know how my customer will use it, how many times it wash it, or maybe how much water it consumes when it wash it, or maybe how they throw away the water bottle. So you can only make some reasonable scenario or assumption when you do the assessment. Okay, and indirect emissions from all other sources. So the purpose of this category is to capture an organization-specific emissions or removals that cannot be reported in other category. So if it is not scope 1, not scope 2, then it will be scope 3. Okay? So it is the organization responsibility to define the content of this particular category. Okay, so if all the other category not suitable, then you can put it in this category. All right. Okay, so yeah, this is only a diagram explaining scope 1 and then scope 2 and then all the scope 3. Okay, so these are direct emissions, and then indirect emissions due to electricity or steam or heating consumption. So you buy from the utility company. And then for scope 3 would be some transportation, distribution of products, use of products, and then waste that you throw away, business travel, transportation, waste. So these are indirect emissions. Okay, let's take a break. Okay, and then after that, let's see how much we can finish. Okay, so before the break, we have learned how to define the organizational boundary, and then what are the definition of Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, and these are reporting boundary, or sometimes we call it operational boundary. Okay, so here is an example. So let's say we have, the companies owns a property, okay, and then within the property, okay, we have some equipment, okay, like a computer, and then some lighting, some electrical appliances using electricity. We have air conditioning. We have, let's say, a town gas heater, and then fire extinguisher, and then toilet, kitchen, so water supply, and it also has some waste. Okay, so consume some product like paper, stationery, and even coffee. Okay, and the company leased and operation and controlled by the company. So these are some leased and operation controlled by the company. And this airplane, okay, not owned or controlled by the company. Okay, but maybe sometimes there is some business travel required by the staff. Okay, so if we are defining the organizational boundary under operational control, okay, then Scope 3 will be the water consumption, the sewage, and then the waste produced, the coffee that you consume, the stationery, the A4 paper that you consumed, and also the transportation due to business travel. Okay? And then for Scope 2, okay, for Scope 2, it would be the electricity consumption and also the town gas consumption. So we have the air conditioning, which consume electricity, the lighting consume electricity, the electrical appliances also consume electricity. So these, and also the town gas, okay, so energy consumption. So these are Scope 2, right? And how about Scope 1? Okay, for Scope 1, the town gas, okay, the town gas will release carbon dioxide inside the building, so direct emissions. So as I have mentioned earlier, the town gas will result in direct and also indirect emissions in Scope 1 and Scope 2. So for Scope 1, okay, the town gas, burning the town gas, then it will release greenhouse gases, and then the use of fire extinguisher, okay, maybe a carbon dioxide extinguisher. So when you use the extinguisher, it may also emit carbon dioxide, right? So this is also Scope 1. Okay, so these two are Scope 1. And then for this car, so if we are using operational control and this car is controlled by the company, then this is also Scope 1. All right? So after you have defined the organizational boundary and also the reporting boundary, okay, you have identified all the sources and sink under Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. The next step is doing the calculation, okay, quantification of emissions and removal. So steps for quantifying greenhouse gas emissions and removals. So first of all, identify the sources and sink, and select quantification approach. So how you determine the quantity. We may use calculation and we may use direct measurement. Okay, we will explain this later. And then lastly, calculate the emissions and removals in the unit carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, identification of greenhouse gas sources and sink. The organization shall identify and document all the relevant greenhouse gas sources and sink included in its reporting boundary. The organization shall include all relevant greenhouse gases. The greenhouse gases sources and sinks shall be identified in accordance with the category defined in the reporting boundary. So whether it is Scope 1, Scope 2, or Scope 3, the detail with which sources and sink are identified and categorized should be consistent with the quantification approach used. So you may have the carbon emissions report every year. Okay, so make sure every year you use the same approach. Okay, maybe equity share approach. Then in all the year, use equity share approach, and it should be the same approach across all the facility owned or related to your company. Okay, so maybe your company has many subsidiary company. Okay, and if you use equity share, then all these subsidiary company will be using equity share. Okay, or maybe you use financial control, then use financial control for all the subsidiary company. Okay, it should be consistent. And then over the years, also the same approach. So this year, equity share. Next year, also equity share. Okay, next is the selection of quantification approach. A quantification approach is a process of obtaining data and determining emissions from sources or removals by sink. Select and use quantification methodologies that minimize uncertainty and yield accurate, consistent, and reproducible results. So when you need to determine what or how to get the data, so make sure you use the most accurate data or method. Okay, so for example, so let's say you have a diesel generator, okay, and when you use the generator, when you burn the diesel oil, greenhouse gases will be produced, right? So you may have different approach to quantify the amount of carbon dioxide emitted. So maybe you can directly use some equipment to measure the amount of carbon dioxide emitted. So maybe in the exhaust flue, okay, you put a measurement equipment on inside the flue. So when the generator operates, then that equipment will measure the amount of carbon dioxide being emitted, okay, from first of the year until the end of the year. So this is the measurement method. Or maybe you can collect the data about the diesel oil consumption. Okay, so maybe in the beginning of the year, okay, inside the fuel tank, it consists of maybe 300 liters of diesel oil. Okay, and then at the end of the year, okay, it leaves only 100 liters. So it means that you have burned 200 liters of diesel oil. And then by using some emission factor, okay, burning every 1 liter of diesel oil, it will release how many tons of carbon dioxide. So you can use these kind of calculation to estimate the amount of carbon dioxide emitted. Okay, so different approach, quantification methodology. And as far as possible, use the most accurate one, or use the most site-related, the local data as far as possible. So by measurement, okay, maybe continuous measurement, continuously measuring the carbon dioxide, or maybe collecting the data once a day, or maybe once a week, okay, so that you have some rough estimation. And as far as possible, use the most accurate method. And by calculation, so greenhouse gas activities, so maybe the diesel oil you consumed, and then multiply by the greenhouse gas emission factor, okay, or maybe some modeling. Okay, maybe you use some equation, some computer modeling method to estimate, okay, to stimulate the amount of carbon dioxide emitted. Okay, based on mass balance approach. So in the first day of the year, you have this amount of diesel oil, and then by the end of the year, it leaves only this amount. Then by the mass balance, you can know how much carbon dioxide or how much diesel oil has been consumed, and then use some emission factor to calculate. Or a combination, okay, a combination of measurement and calculation. Okay, example, greenhouse gas emission from fuel combustion. So the quantification method is to use the activity data, okay, like the amount of fuel being consumed. you can refer to the receipts, okay, like how much diesel oil that you purchased, okay, or maybe by measurement, okay, maybe you have a gas meter, okay, to measure the amount of, maybe the amount of diesel oil be consumed, or if you don't use the emission factor, you can directly measure the amount of gas being emitted. And for the greenhouse gas emission factor, you can refer to the IPCC default value. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, will publish some emission factor, okay, or the general reporting protocol also has published the emission factor. Okay, these are some international emission factor, so you may refer to these emission factor, or you may take sampling. Okay, you may take local sampling. Okay, like for the diesel generator. So for consumption of every 1 liter of diesel oil, okay, then how many carbon dioxide is being emitted? You have a meter to measure, and then using this calculation, you can project, okay, maybe in this year I am consuming 200 liters of diesel oil. So using that data, using that factor, I can project how much I would be emitting for the carbon dioxide. Okay, the organization shall calculate the greenhouse gas emissions and removals in accordance with the quantification approach selected. The period for which greenhouse gas emissions and removals have been calculated shall also be reported. The organization shall convert the quantity of each type of greenhouse gases to tons of carbon dioxide equivalent using the global warming potential. Okay, like for methane, okay, so the radiative forcing by 1 ton of methane would be different with the radiative forcing of 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So you cannot just directly add 1 ton of methane adding to 1 ton of carbon dioxide. No, okay, they have different unit. So you have to use the global warming potential, convert 1 ton of methane into how many tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, so using the global warming potential. These are the global warming potential value, and these are the values advised by the IPCC. The IPCC has published different reports. So the second report, the third, the fourth, and the fifth report, and they have updated the global warming potential. So this is the most updated value. So in the workshop, you are recommended to use the right column, okay, the rightmost column of global warming potential. Okay, the organizations shall select and collect greenhouse gas activity data consistent with the requirements of the selected, I think we have explained this already. Okay, select data that reduce bias and uncertainty as far as practical by using the best quality data available. So, as far as possible, use the most local data, site-specific data. So if site-specific data is not available, then use local data. If local data is not available, then use some data recommended by the international guidelines. Okay, non-site specific data should only be used where collection of site-specific data is not practical and for process of minor importance. When the collection of site-specific data is not practical, primary data based on global or regional average collected by regional or international organizations and which have undergone third-party verification should be used. So same. Use local data as far as possible. So maybe the one directly measure on site. If this one is not available, then maybe you can refer some local emission factor. If local emission factor is not available, then refer to some regional emission factor. And then if this is still not available, then refer to international guidelines. Okay, the organization shall select or develop with explanation the greenhouse gas emission and removal factors. And these are just some consideration, like derived from recognized region, international guideline, or maybe are appropriate for the source and sink, are appropriate for the current time of quantification, and then take account of quantification uncertainty, and are calculated in a manner intended to yield accurate and reproducible results, are consistent with the intended use of the greenhouse gas inventory. So these are just some consideration to make sure that your calculation is accurate and consistent. Okay, just general recommendation. Okay, before we explain the base year inventory, last week, some students asked me about the reporting, the reporting boundary for the utility company. So I have thought about the emissions, and then, I have prepared this table for explaining the emissions by the utility company. So let's say we have a power company, okay, like the Hong Kong Electric. Okay, they will burn the natural gas or maybe oil in order to produce electricity, right? So we would have some greenhouse gas emissions due to the electricity generated by the power company, and this amount of electricity generated would be consumed by the end user, okay? And this electricity will lead to certain greenhouse gas emissions. So for this amount of greenhouse gas emission, it should be quantified as scope 1 for the power company. So if you are the power company and you want to report your carbon emissions, then this amount of emissions would be under scope 1, right? Direct emissions. You are burning the coal, you are burning the natural gas, the oil directly, right? So this would be scope 1. And if you are the end user of the electricity that is produced by this company, then these greenhouse gas emission should be reported under scope 2, right? So I think this one is obvious. And next, we also have electricity power, which is due to the transmission loss. So we have the overhead cables, right? We have the overhead cables for transmitting electricity from the power plant and then all the way to the city center and to the company. So for these, there would also be some emissions. Okay, so some power loss along the transmission line, and then because of these transmission loss, some carbon dioxide or some greenhouse gases may be emitted. And these emissions is still within the power company. Okay, these are all due to the electricity generated within the power company. It's just that some of the electricity is being lost along the way of transmission. So these emissions will still be under scope 1 for reporting by the power company. And if you are the end user, okay, maybe a company is buying electricity from the utility, from the power company, and some of the transmission loss will indirectly contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, then these should be under scope 3, okay, in the report by the end user, okay, because these are transmission loss. These are not directly due to the activities that you, of the company, okay, but more indirect, so not energy consumption, so you didn't consume these amount of electricity, right? These are all loss. So these are transmission loss, so under scope 3. And there may also be electricity generated by the power company and also consumed by the power company due to the utility operation. So there would be some energy consumption due to the operation of the power plant. Maybe just the office, okay, the lighting, or the utility, those plant. And these energy, these electricity, if they are the electricity generated by the power company itself and then consumed by the power company also, So this will be under scope 1 if you are reporting the emissions for the power company. Okay, because these are the electricity generated within the power company. Okay, and then consumed by the power company, so generated, and then it leads to direct emissions of carbon dioxide. Okay, then within scope 1, all right? And then if you are the end user, okay, so maybe you are also farly, remotely, indirectly responsible for these emissions. So if you want to report these emissions, it would be under scope 3. Okay, but I think this one is quite, remotely relevant. Okay, another example would be also power generation. Okay, but we have a retailer. Okay, like we have a power company. Okay, generate some electricity, and then these electricity would be sold to a electricity retailer, and this electricity retailer sell the electricity again to the end user. You see what I mean? Okay, just like the CLP. Okay, CLP buy electricity from the Daya Bay power plant and then sell the electricity to us. Then CLP is kind of like the electricity retailer, right? So there would be electricity generated by the power company and then transmitted to the electricity retailer and finally consumed by the end user. So if it is the report of the power company, then it would be under scope 1, right? So these are due to the burning of the natural gas or maybe the nuclear power in the power plant. So directly release of the carbon dioxide. So scope 1 for the power company. And then for the electricity retailer, these electricity consumption not consumed by the retailer. Okay, he is only the company that buy and then sell to other. So it would be not scope 1 and also not scope 2 because it didn't consume this amount of electricity. So not scope 2, and it would be scope 3. And if you are the end user, okay, you consume the electricity that is sold by the retailer and actually generated by this power company. So anyway, so if you are the end user of those electricity that you buy, then must be in scope 2. And next, okay, there will also be some electricity power loss during the transmission from the power company to the electricity retailer. Okay, so like from the Daya Bay to the CLP distributor. So these emissions is due to, or these emissions is due to the electricity generated in the power plant. So if you are reporting for power company, then definitely also scope 1. And for the retailer, for the CLP, these power loss would be under scope 2 because it is like the electricity consumed by the retailer when they buy the electricity. So it would be reported under scope 2 when you are reporting for the electricity retailer. Okay, and then if you are the end user, these transmission loss would be the other indirect, so scope 3. And there will also be electricity generated by the power company and then consumed by the retailer's utility. Okay, so maybe the electricity generated by the Daya Bay and then consumed by the CLP office. Then these emissions would be scope 1 for the power company and then scope 2 for the retailer. Okay, because they are paying the electricity bill in order to consume this electricity. So under scope 2, and for the end user, so if you want to report these remotely indirect emissions, then it would be under scope 3. All right? So I hope that this table clears some of the confusions, or maybe I'm adding more confusions. Okay, so yeah, these are just some additional information, okay? So for your reference. Okay, so base year greenhouse gas inventory. So if you remember, like we have some base year emission, right? So for the Hong Kong government, so we target to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by half in the year 2035. So it means 10 years later, we want to reduce our carbon footprint to 50%. But compared to which year? So there must be a base year. And according to the Climate Action Plan, it is comparing to 2005. So what the government mean? Okay, reducing 50% of the carbon footprint is 50% of the carbon footprint in the year 2005. So the year 2005 is the base year. Okay, that's the meaning of base year. So the organization shall establish a historical base year for greenhouse gas emissions and removals for comparative purposes or to meet the greenhouse gas program requirements or other intended use of the greenhouse gas inventory. Okay, so when you read the ESG report, you will find that, okay, maybe the CLP target to reduce certain amount, a certain percentage, so also refer to the base year. Okay, so this is for reporting, for the inventory, or for some targets, okay, some reduction targets. Select a base year for which verifiable greenhouse gas emissions or removal data are available. If sufficient information on historical greenhouse gas emissions or removals is not available, then the organization may use its first greenhouse gas inventory period as the base year. And in the report, you have to explain why you select that year as the base year, and then develop a greenhouse gas inventory for the base year, and it should be consistent with the provisions of the standard, and also consistent approach being used for the base year and the estimation assessment years. The organization may change its base year, but it shall justify any change to the base year. So you may change, maybe the government, the Hong Kong government now said that we changed the base year from 2005 to 2009. Okay, then you have to explain why, okay? And sometimes we really need to adjust the base year emissions. To ensure that the comparison of emissions over time is internally consistent, base year emissions must closely reflect an organization's current organizational structure. Adjustments to base year emissions are generally made to reflect organizational changes, such as mergers, acquisitions, or divestment. So for the business, it is quite often that sometimes a company may buy another company, right? So if, like company A, okay, buy company B in 1 year, then the emissions of company B will now belong to company A, right? So if 1 year, okay, like in the year, okay, 2020, okay, company A buy company B, then in the reporting of the emissions in 2020, then the emissions of company A would be much higher, right? Because it includes the emissions from company B also. And if we are comparing to the base year, okay, like maybe in 2005, then the increase of greenhouse gases could be quite significant. And maybe it is not fair, okay, saying that we have increased the emissions by 30% comparing to the base year. So it seems that the performance is very bad. Okay, but in fact, it is due to the structural organizational change. Okay, so in this case, we will adjust the emissions of the base year. So if in the report of 2020, I am adding the emissions from company B, then in the base year, I should also add the emissions of company B to the base year emissions. Okay, this is the meaning, because we want to make a fair comparison, okay, apple to apple. So emissions of company A in 2005 and then comparing to the emissions of same company A in 2020. And then if you have company A and company B, then in the base year, also company A and company B. You see what I mean? Okay, I will explain more about how to recalculate the base year emissions. The organization shall not recalculate its base year greenhouse gas inventory to account for changes in facility production level, including the closing or opening of facilities. So unlike organizational change, for example, if like if CLP, okay, maybe they close down a coal-firing generator, okay, then it may reduce a lot of emissions, okay, because they don't use coal-fire generator anymore. They use oil or natural gas, okay, which is more efficient. Then it will lead to reduce of emissions. So if they close certain facility, and it is not about the structural organizational change, then they should not adjust the base year emission. You see what I mean? Okay, just like maybe for a company, they have like shut down one of the manufacturing plant, okay, because that manufacturing plant is not efficient. So they close down that manufacturing plant. Then it is not about the organizational change, okay, not about they buy a company or maybe they sell the company to another organization, okay, then they should not adjust the base year emissions. So generally, only if there is merger, okay, acquisition or divestment, then you may need to recalculate the base year emissions. So base year emissions should be recalculated when there is a structural change in organizational boundary, okay, like merger, acquisition, or diversion, okay, and it trigger a significant cumulative change in the entity's base year emissions, okay, or there is a change in calculation methodology or emission factors triggers a significant cumulative change in the entity's base year emissions. So maybe you need to renew or revise the calculation methodology. So maybe I don't rely on calculation anymore. I rely on measurement. And when I use measurement method to quantify the carbon dioxide emissions, it results in a very significant difference of quantity. Then you may adjust the base year emissions. Or when there is a significant error or number of cumulative error that are collectively significant, discovered. And what do we mean by significant? It would be about 5% or larger. Okay, so when you buy a company, okay, or acquire a company, and it lead to 5% increase or 5% increase in the base year emissions, then you have to recalculate the base year emissions. Okay, just like the example that I used earlier. So company A is buying company B in 2020. And if the emissions of company A together with company B in 2005, okay, which is the base year, can result in more than 5% of the increase comparing to just company A, then you may recalculate the base year emissions. Okay, in order to maintain the consistency between data sets, base year emissions need to be recalculated when structural changes occur in the company that change the inventory boundary, okay, change the organizational boundary. For example, there is acquisition or divestment. So this is an example extracted from the General Reporting Protocol. So let's say, this is the base year emissions. And just like for company A, okay, so company A, it has a emissions of 98 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. And then for company B, okay, 2 tons. So 2 tons, and then this one 98 tons. So this is company B. And then in year 2, they buy the company B. Okay, this company acquire this company also. and then it lead to 2 tons of carbon dioxide emissions adding to the base year. Okay, and 2 comparing to 100, this change would be less than 5%, then not significant. Okay, or in another example, okay, 94% for company A, and then for company B, maybe 6. And in year 2, okay, this company acquire this company. Okay, and then in the base year calculations, so this 6 would be like 6% of the total of the base year emissions, which is larger than 5%. Then we will need to recalculate the base year emissions. Okay, so we have the new year and the base year. Okay, so if in the new year, okay, we acquire or maybe we divest a company and lead to the base year emissions has a very significant change, larger than 5%, then we have to recalculate the emissions of the base year. Another example, okay, in year 1, this is the base year emissions, okay, 100%. And then in year 2, less X. So maybe this X facility doesn't belong to this company anymore, maybe sold to another company. And the difference is only 3%, not significant. And then in year 3, okay, this Y facility sold to another company, then the difference would be 6%. So in year 3, this would be the base year emission. Okay, you have to recalculate the emissions because we have a significant change. And then in year 4, okay, maybe another facility is being sold to another company. And then this time, the difference comparing to this base year emissions is only 3%. Or, yeah, 3% of 94. Anyway, not significant, less than 5%. Then we will keep the same base year emissions. Okay, so this recalculation is for the base year. Yeah, just another example. And for the recalculations of the base year emissions, there are different approaches. And this is a simple one. We call it, fixed base year. This is the simple one. And let's take a look at this example. Okay, base year emissions recalculations. So let's say the acquisition of company A of a company B in the middle of year 2 on June 30th. So in the middle of the year, company A buy company B. Okay, so company A acquire company B. And assuming that the emissions from January to June are always the same as the emissions from June to December. So it means that so company A is buying company B in the middle of the year. And for first half of the year and the second half of the year has the same emissions. And this is the emissions by company A and company B. Okay, so for company A, for year 1 to year 4, they all have 10 units of emissions. And for year 1, which is the base year, okay, company B has 1 unit of emissions, and then second year, 2 units, and then year 3 and year 4, 3 units of emissions. And in the middle of year 2, company A buy company B, okay? And the change of base year emissions, so if you check out here, so 1, or if it is half of the year, then 0.5. So 0.5 to 10 would be 5%. So quite significant, right? So 0.5 to the total of 10 would be 5%. So it is treated as a significant difference. So we have to recalculate the emissions of the base year. So the emissions should not be 10 anymore. Okay, so we have to recalculate. And there are different methods of recalculation. And the first one I want to explain is the fixed base year. Okay, and for the fixed base year, there are two options, pro rata and all year. Okay, for the pro rata, so it means if company A acquire company B in the middle of the year, then for that year, company A should be responsible for half of the emissions, right? By pro rata, by ratio, so half. So let's see if we are using pro rata, okay? And then in the year 2 report, how should we report the emissions? So for the year 2 report, so no year 3, no year 4, because it is only year 2, and year 1 is the base year. Okay, so for year 2, in the middle of the year 2, company A buy company B. So by pro rata, then company A should be responsible for half of the emissions, right? So for year 2, the emissions in company B is 2 units. Then half would be 1 unit. So you can see here in the year 2 report, the total emissions by company A and company B should be 10 plus 1, right? By pro rata. So 10, company A, and then for company B, half. So 1, half of 2, so 1. And for the base year, just the same, also by pro rata. So although in year 1, company A has not buy company B, okay, not yet, because this acquisition happened in year 2. So in year 1, not yet happened. But because we want to recalculate the emissions in year 1, so for year 1 also by pro rata. So for company B, we just add half of the emissions. That is 0.5 adding to 10, then the total will be 10.5. So we have adjusted the base year emissions from 10 to 10.5 units. Okay, this is the base year adjustment. And this is for the year 2 report. And for the year 3 report, in year 3, company A will wholly own company B from the first day of the year to the last day of the year. So in year 3, company A should be responsible for 100% of the emissions, right? Then in the year 3 report, for the year 3, the total emissions should be 10 plus 3, 100%, because in year 3, company A will own company B in the whole year. So 10 plus 3. And then because we are comparing apple to apple, so if year 3, 100%, then year 2, also 100%, year 1, the base year, also 100%. So now the base year emissions is adjusted to 11. All right? So this is the most straightforward base year adjustment, okay? Fixed base year pro rata. Okay, this is fixed base year because we use year 1 as the base year for all the year. So year 2 report, year 1 is the base year. Year 3 report, year 1 is also the base year. So it is called the fixed base year. And it is pro rata because we are calculating the emissions by proportion, right? So apart from pro rata, we have all year. For all year, it will be, so we refer to the end of the year. So like in year 2, in the end of year 2, company A own company B. Then we just treat all the emissions by company B will belong to company A, not 50%, but 100%. Okay, because by the end of year 2, company A own company B. Then company A just responsible for 100% of the emissions. So in this way, for the year 2 report, okay, in the year 2, by the end of the year 2, company A own company B, then 100% of the emissions. So if year 2, 100%, the base year should also be 100%. So 100% of 1, that would be 10 plus 1. And for year 2, 100% of 2, so 10 plus 2. So this is the fixed base year, all year approach. All right? So after this lesson, maybe you can try to fill up this table. Okay, I will give you the answer next week. Another approach would be the rolling base year. So earlier we have fixed base year. So every year's report we use year 1 as the base year. And for the rolling base year, the base year will change, will be updated. Okay, so in the year 2 report, year 1 is the base year. In the year 3 report, year 2 is the base year. In the year 4 report, year 3 will be the base year. Okay, one example. So anyway, so we have a changing base year over time. Okay, so for year after year, we will update the base year. So this is another approach. And for this rolling base year, there are 4 options: pro rata, same year adjustment; all year, same year adjustment; pro rata, year after adjustment; and all year, year after adjustment. So let's take a look at pro rata, same year adjustment. Okay, the first one. So we have rolling base year. So in the year 2 report, year 1 is the base year. In the year 3 report, year 2 is the base year. And we are using same year adjustment and pro rata. So same year. So if it is a year 2 year 2 report, then we will check out year 2 ownership of that company. So in the year 2, company A owned half of the time of company B because it happened in the middle of the year, right? The acquisition happened in the middle of the year, and we are using pro rata. Then company A should be responsible for half of the emissions of company B. So in the year 2 report, half of 2, so 1 unit. So if the year responsible for 50%, then the base year also 50%. And then in the year 3 report, year 2 is the base year, okay, not year 1, so you can forget about year 1. So year 2 is the base year. So in the year 3, company A wholly owned company B from the first day of the year to the end of the year. So we will be using 100%, so adding 3 to 10. And then for the base year, which is now year 2, also 100%. So adding 2 to 10. Okay, so this is the pro rata same year adjustment. Another one would be all year same year adjustment. So for all year, we will determine at the end of the year whether that company owned that company. So in the year 2 report, okay, by the end of the year 2, company A owned company B, then responsible for 100%. So 100% of 2 will be 2. So 2 adding 10. And then in the base year, which is year 1, also 100%. Okay, because in the year 2, by the end of the year 2, company A will own company B for the whole year. So responsible, I should say by the end of the year 2, company A own company B. Then for the all year approach, company A will be responsible for all the emissions of company B in that year. So 100%. And then for the base year, also 100%. And then for year 3, the base year is now updated to year 2. And by the end of year 3, company A will also own company B. So company A will be responsible for 100% of the emissions. So 100%, 3. Okay, and then for year 2, 100% of 2 will be 2. And for year 4, okay, it is not shown here, but in the year 4, Company A will also totally own Company B and 100%, so the emissions will be 10 plus 3, and the base year now updated to year 3, so also 100%, so 10 plus 3 also. Okay, the third type is the pro rata year after. Okay, for year after means that what happened this year, the acquisition happened this year, but I just ignore it. Okay, I will account for the acquisition only next year. Okay, so it is year after. Okay, you see what I mean? Company A acquire Company B in year 2, but they just ignore it. Okay, they will account for the emissions only starting year 3. So if we are using pro rata year after, then in the year 2 report, we just ignore the acquisition. So no Company B emissions, 0%, 0%. We will consider, or we will include the emissions of Company B only in the year 3 report, okay, which is the year after the acquisition. Okay, so after the acquisitions, then referring to the base year, so now the year 3 report, the base year is updated to year 2. So according to the base year, the acquisition happened in the middle. Then Company A should be responsible for 50% of the emissions. So here, 50% for the base year. And for year 3, also 50%. So 50%, 50%. So adding 1, adding 1.5. And in the year 4 report, okay, in the year 4 report, if you refer to the base year, Company A will own Company B for the whole year, so 100%. So 3 and 3 for year 3 and year 4. So this is the pro rata year after adjustment. Okay, and for the all year, year after, so all year means we just consider by the end of the year whether it owned the company or not. If it owned the company, then responsible for 100%. But it is year after. So when the acquisition occur at year 2, we ignore it. Okay. So for year 2 report, although the acquisition happened in the year 2, but it is a year after. So we will consider this acquisition only after year 2. So in the year 3 report, okay, we will consider the acquisition, and it is a all year. So by the end of year 2, Company A will own Company B. Then Company A responsible for 100%. So in the year 3 report, the base year adding 100%, and year 3 also 100%. Okay, so this is how we recalculate the base year emissions. And there are also some tables, like some exercise. You can try to fill in the table. So this table is according to the fixed base year. Okay, so Company C acquired Company D in the middle of the year, similar to this one, base year, fixed base year emissions. And then this one is using fixed base year. Fixed base year. This one is using pro rata, and this one is using all year. Okay, so there are 2 options for fixed base year, pro rata and all year. And then for the rolling base year, 4 options. So pro rata, same year, all year, same year adjustment, pro rata year after, and all year, year after. Okay? And apart from acquisition, there is also divestment. So like here, Company A originally owned, Company C, Company A divests Facility C to Company B. So this is Facility C. So Company A originally owned Facility C, but it sell Facility C out to another company in the middle of the year. Okay, then in the year 3 and year 4 not belong to this company anymore. So how to readjust the base year? You may also use the fixed base year, pro rata, all year, or rolling base year. So these are some examples. Okay, so maybe we just study the acquisition first. So after you understand how to recalculate the base year emissions for acquisition, then you can try to calculate for the divestment. All right, so maybe I will just stop here, and if you have time, you can try to think about how to fill up this table. Okay, we will talk about the answer in the lecture next week. And when we have finished this set of PowerPoint, we will also talk about the workshop example. Okay, this is the example about the workshop assignment. So yeah, later on when you do the workshop, you will see something very similar. Okay, just the details, some items, some numbers are different. Okay, so this is the question and these are the answer. Okay, I will give you the answer sheet with no words, no number. So you have to fill in all these numbers yourself. Okay, but this is the sample. So if you can understand this sample, then in the workshop, it should not be too difficult. All right, so next week, I will explain this example after we have finished the PowerPoint. Okay, so see you next week.